Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I don't have much to say this morning. This is the Gunslingers Debt, Part 2. Forearms and Twintail were aware of the surprise attack by now, and rolled off the top of the rock to face him directly. He spun the staff around in his hands to smash it across Twintail's skull as the metal and wood shattered, staggering the creature as he jumped up to grab Blue Mask's staff off the rock where the dead marauder had dropped it. Forearms was lunging at him now, though, and the gunslinger barely had time to bring the new staff up to knock aside the creature's claws that swiped at his face. It hissed at him beneath the mask and lunged once more, simply tackling him to the ground then. The gunslinger grunted and gasped as he was knocked to the ground beneath the marauder, holding up the staff between them to try and keep it off, wincing at the smell of its rancid breath as a puff of black air escaped its mask. Behind Forearms, Twintail had recovered, shaking his head and adjusting his cracked mask as he raised his staff. But with Forearms on top of the gunslinger, he didn't have a clear shot. Hissing and clicking, he was no doubt telling Forearms to get off, so he had a shot. When Forearms looked back, the gunslinger used his moment of hesitation to his advantage. He shoved hard with the staff, twisting it as he did to slip the staff up between the marauder's two left arms, and aimed at Twintail's when he thumbed the gem. As it snapped and whistled, the bolt slammed the marauder in the chest, sending him tumbling back. With most of Forearms' bulk off him now, the gunslinger rolled forward, reaching out as far as he could while the marauder tangled with his legs. Forearms hissed and the gunslinger gasped as he felt claws digging into the flesh of his legs through the pants, but he grabbed the staff Twintails had dropped and rolled over, aiming it down between his legs, jamming the staff into Forearms' face before firing. Much like with Red Leg, instead of a snap and a whistle, this time it was a snap and a wet pop, as Forearms' head exploded, coating the gunslinger in yet more blue blood and green-gray brains. The heat of the explosion singeing his legs a bit as well, causing him to hiss in pain. But he pushed through it, kicking the corpse free of his legs and getting up behind the rock they were using as cover. "Your cannon should be clear," he called out.
"Who the fuck is that?"
he heard a voice call out. "Doesn't fucking matter. Load it. Load it now before the ogre returns." Was that what had downed the frigate? The gunslinger peeked over the top of the rock and saw the soldiers rushing to load the cannon, even as he heard the bellowing roar of the ogre from just outside the circle of bone trees. There was a soldier just at the edge of the trees who looked up and screamed as the gunslinger saw a massive gnarled hand crush the unlucky bastard into the tree, turning his brown and red uniform into mostly red. It stomped into the clearing then, 4 large chubby legs ending in stubby feet. What wasn't pinkish boil-laden flesh was covered beneath painted wrappings and a massive mask. Considering how many hairs were needed to stitch it together, it must have killed hundreds of people by now. Only a single giant purple eye was exposed from the top of the mask as it bellowed out, 2 fat arms raised into the sky as it began to charge the downed frigate. Thankfully, the gun crew were faster, though, and the loader had only just cleared the mouth of the gun when another crewman yanked the cord to fire. The cannonball shot straight and true as it slammed through the ogre's front leg, amputating it at the knee before slamming into the back right leg, smashing it into a twisted mess of bone, sinew, and flesh. The ogre screamed as it toppled over, its eye flashing as a purple beam shot wildly, cutting through some of the down frigate's sails and rigging. The soldiers cried and cursed as they dove and ran for cover to avoid the falling debris, but the gunslinger ignored them as he ran forward. He knew the ogre might be down, but it wasn't out, and the staff wouldn't cut it. Tossing aside the marauder weapon, he ran towards the soldier who had been smashed into the bone tree. Thankfully, his carbine hadn't been crushed in the blow, and the gunslinger grabbed it. Rolling as 2 or 3 whistling blue bolts sailed through the air he'd just been in. As he came up to his feet, he aimed at a marauder across the clearing and pulled the trigger. He was rewarded with a splash of blue in the air as the marauder's head snapped back. Then he worked the lever on the carbine and ran towards the downed ogre as it twisted and writhed, trying to push itself back up. It was trying to reposition its head at the cannon still being reloaded when he jumped up onto its back, firing point blank into the back of its head, the bullet lodging deep into the back of its skull. But that just made the ogre howl in anger and jerk around, fat hands trying to reach back and swat him off. He ducked under the stubby fat fingers and gripped the back of the mask for support, letting it swing wildly a few more times before working the lever and shooting it in the back of the skull once more. This time, as he bellowed in anger and pain, it flopped hard to its side, which sent the gunslinger flying off. But he rolled as he sailed through the air and came up on his feet. The ogre tried to look at him for a moment, but the cannon crew had other plans. "Fire!" the captain yelled before the roar of the cannon filled the air and the cannonball succeeded where his bullets had failed. It punched a hole straight through the ogre's mask, shattering it to pieces that went flying as the cannonball tore through the flesh and bone of its skull. It didn't even go all the way through, but the monstrosity slumped to its side dead just the same. There were cheers from the soldiers as the remaining marauders on the far side of the clearing began to run, skitter, and scramble away. But the captain just raised her pistol and shouted, "Quit cheering and shoot, you idiots!" The gunslinger was already ahead of her as he ran after them, working the lever on the carbine, raising it to his shoulder, firing, and then repeating the action in an almost mechanical fashion. One more marauder. 2, 3, 4. Click. He looked down at the carbine and sighed as it was out of bullets. He'd used all 7. As the soldiers ran after the fleeing marauders to give chase, he looped back to the wrecked frigate and began to pick bullets off one of the other dead soldiers. "That's government property." He looked up as the captain stood over him, her pistol holstered, but the flag still in the other hand as it fluttered in the breeze. It had a few singe marks from the marauder's bolt, but it was still flying. "Should I give it back?" the gunslinger asked as he stopped his rummaging. The captain looked around the clearing for a moment as her wounded were dragged into the shade of the wreck so their sawbones could look them over. "Fuck it. We lose property out here plenty," she shrugged. "What are you doing out here, gunslinger? Can't be a bounty for 100 miles in any direction. More." "I wasn't out here for bounty," he mentioned as he went back to pulling bullets from the dead man's satchel and tucking them into his own belt. "There was a nest. I went to clear it. Half a day east. They were expecting me." He nodded his head and rose up, walking to another body to start rummaging through his gear. "While that does explain why you're way the fuck out here without a night pack, I still want to know who the hell would pay you to clear a nest out here. And why just one? This place is littered with them," the captain asked as he worked. "I wasn't paid. I was told this area was supposed to be safe," he replied as she let out a short laugh. "Safe my ass. If you were meant to say there haven't been many attacks, that's true, but it's only because they've got a war chief somewhere gathering them up. And a man like you doesn't do anything without pay. I know your type. Marauders aren't your specialty, are they? You're behaving like a homesteader." The gunslinger paused at that, and then resumed looting the body before him as she laughed once more. "Ha! A gunslinger turned homesteader. Out here. You can't be that dumb. Cheap land, grand opportunities, unclaimed wealth, untapped potential. A prospector I could trust. I thought I could trust," he muttered before stopping and rising up. He had enough bullets for now. He moved to check the marauder corpse nearby. "Have you seen any with brown talismans?" He walked over to the nearest corpse, turning it over as he looked for the talismans. They wove little bits of metal and shiny things into their wrappings under their ponchos, but they all had a prized talisman they kept. They were little planks of some strange metal no one could find elsewhere, studded with bits of metal all across them. Most were green, but he'd seen red, blue, and last night, brown. The bodies here had green talismans, it seemed, as he tossed the religious artifact aside. "These are the first we fought on the ground," the captain mentioned. "Outposts saw distress flares from Fort Hemingway early yesterday morning." The day after he had left. "We were sent to find out what was up, but obviously we didn't make it. Look, you helped us out of a bad spot. If you wait, another ship should be along in a day or two, and I'll make sure you have a berth waiting for you. We'll get you back to Fountain Spire at least." "I can't wait, and I'm not going south," the gunslinger said as he began to walk west once more. "You're crazy."
So you invested in a sandpit? You can't be so stubborn as to try and save it. The marauders are out in force. They might have sealed off the Heartbreak Pass. If they did, there's no getting through for a day to north or south.
She followed after him as he walked to the edge of the spire. I know. His pistol freshly loaded and his holster full of bullets, he turned to look back at her and reached up to tip the brim of his hat. A gesture she returned before he faced west and jumped, carbine gripped tight in his hands as he dove, picked up by the hot winds once more when his glider wings snapped out. The sun beat down on him through the rest of the day. He wasn't sure how long the canteen would last, even though every time he opened it, it felt full. So he took small sips each time, rationing what might possibly never end. But he didn't want to risk being a glutton only to be dry when he needed it most. The miles dragged on and the hours passed with the constant trek west, the sun curling overhead before it began to dip back down the horizon. Even as it shone on his face and he had to squint and avert his gaze, he didn't stop moving. As his legs ached and muscles began to beg for rest, he would keep moving along each plateau and dive down yet again to be carried up by the strong air currents, lifted by the lava between the spires. He could see Heartbreak Pass in the distance as the sun illuminated the distant gap in the ridge, even taller plateaus and spires. It was too far from the edge to get enough wind to fly over, so travelers had to walk down one of the two gaps, which when viewed from a distance looked like two halves of a heart, broken down the middle. As the sun finally sank beyond the horizon and the sky was left orange with its departure, he looked for the telltale signs of fires that any encamped marauders would have going, but he saw none. While the shadow of night began to take over the land and the sky grew even darker, the stars came out, shining bright above him, far brighter than in the city he'd grown up in. He'd always loved to lay back and stare at them late into the night while the moon crawled across the sky. But tonight he didn't even glance up. By the time he finally made it to the more solid row of rock that blocked his path, the sun had set completely. But the light of the full moon gave him enough to see by. He wasn't quite sure which path to take, the left or the right, but as he walked closer he saw something that chose for him. A nomad woman sitting on a boulder beside the left path. He wasn't a fool. He hadn't stumbled across her by chance. She was letting him see her. Even as he walked closer, he could see the pearlescent glow of her eyes, like a cat's eyes when they caught the reflection of light in the dark. She had her cloak wrapped around her body as nomads always did. It was painted and colored to blend right in with the rocks around her in such a way that he was positive, if she covered her head and rifle, he'd have never seen her. But she wasn't covering up. She was sitting upright, the top end of her rifle poking up from under the cloak as well. Her curled horns of bone and deep blue sparkling opal flickering in the night of the full moon. Marauders had always used staffs, but nomads used rifles. And they liked them long, longer than they were tall. No one knew where they got them, or who made the bullets. They weren't like any he'd seen made, and no one had ever seen any signs of a nomad forge. But they got them from somewhere. As the gunslinger passed by the boulder the nomad was perched on top of, he reached up to gently tug the brim of his hat as he passed. The nomad, for her part, dipped her head and horns for a moment. Then she shifted, stretching out atop the boulder as her cloak fluttered a moment, and then settled atop her as she positioned her rifle facing east. Even though he knew exactly where she was still hard to see. No marauders would be coming through the pass so long as she was there. He wasn't sure why he'd earned this gift, but he was thankful for it. On he walked throughout the night, ignoring the continued protest of his limbs and body as his muscles ached and groaned. He was too driven by his purpose to be stopped now by anything short of death itself. It took him half the night to walk the length of the pass. His only company the soft call of the owls that hunted what few rodents lived in such a desolate and unwelcoming terrain. Once he reached the other side, his usual pattern of diving and climbing the wind started fresh once more. He was getting closer now, and he could feel the anxiety building within him with every step closer to his goal. By the time the sun finally rose to his back, he had gained miles more on his destination, never ceasing, just taking small sips of that cold, refreshing water from the canteen the stranger had given him. Many a man might think hard on that gift, but not the gunslinger. He didn't have room for such concerns in his heart. Not now. As the sun began to steadily climb in the sky once more, he came across one of the few landmarks in the region of broken spires. A bluestone mine he'd seen in the distance. He wasn't sure what the miners could do to help, but at the very least they might have news of the goings-on, or anyone he could convince to come with, just in case his worst fears were realized. As he grew closer to the mine, he frowned at the setup of the buildings. It didn't look quite like any bluestone mine he'd been to before. What was off about it? No guard towers, and he couldn't see any distinct barracks either. His frown deepened as he caught the last hot gust of air to fly him up onto the edge of the large spire the mine was positioned on. What sort of mine didn't have a barracks or guard towers? But he could see the white steam rising from the central shaft, which meant it had to be operational. They didn't even have lookouts in case marauders or human bandits showed up. Where was the singing? It wasn't like they could carry any half-worthy tune, but he was used to hearing miners sing while they worked, to help pass the time if nothing else. But this place was quiet. Quiet enough to make the hairs rise on the back of his neck as he wondered what was wrong with this place. Until he finally saw the first of the workers moving a wheelbarrow full of blue stone from the central shaft to the processing mill. Clockers. That's why it was all wrong. He was the only living thing here. Even as he walked into the center of the compound, the clockers all around him just kept working without paying any attention. Their mechanical clockwork bodies never tiring from simple labor strains like men. Most of these didn't even have wind-up keys in the back. Must be some new models he wasn't familiar with. He'd heard Cogs go on and on about the great inventor himself and his divine vision. But the gunslinger had met the man once. He wasn't a great inventor. He was a nervous little man with broken glasses who'd been swept up in something greater than himself. The question was, why were clockers mining bluestone? Wasn't there laws against using clockers for manual labor over able-bodied, living people? There had been unrest and riots over that very issue if the papers and wires from the cities were right, but he didn't have time for that. "Hey, I need help," he said, and the nearest few clockers stopped in their tracks. Their mechanical heads turning to face him, deep blue eyes examining him. It started a chain reaction through the entire mine as they all stopped in their work and began to gather round him. The gunslinger looked around nervously once he was surrounded, but finally, one of the clockers opened its hinged wooden jaw and spoke. "I help." He stepped forward and pulled a small piece of its foot off and set it before the gunslinger. Then another stepped forward. "I help." It picked up another piece from its foot and set beside the first piece. On it went then as they would all step forward, pulling a piece of themselves off and setting it into place with the others. The gunslinger stood there, watching as they began to build a clocker before him, each of the others given what they could spare without sacrificing anything they couldn't. It was built up, piece by piece, over the span of minutes. It looked different from the others too, he noted. The body seemed bulkier, the arms and legs heavier and more robust. Finally, it stood hunched over, missing only a head. That's when they parted and he saw the foreman. It slowly walked forward on 6 legs, 4 long, multi-jointed arms extended from its torso, and watching him with 3 very intricate heads. He could see the steam pouring from its back as it needed more than just bluestone to function, apparently. It reached up and carefully disconnected its middle head, setting into place on the new clocker they had made. The 4 long arms moving over the new clocker to tighten screws and check gears until it was satisfied. Then another clocker stepped forward with a chunk of raw bluestone, the size of the gunslinger's clenched fists. They opened a panel in the back of its chest and set it inside before closing the panel. With that, the clockers backed up slowly and raised their arms to the sky. They began to sing, except it wasn't singing, it was chimes, like those in a clock. They chimed together in harmony to sing a wordless song that made the hairs on the back of the gunslinger's neck and arms rise further.
There was a soft crackling in the air as the song seemed to reach its climax. And then the clocker in the middle jerked and popped for a moment before it opened its deep blue eyes and stood up straight.
"I help,"
it crackled after a moment. Then the circle of clockers split before them and the gunslinger quickly walked past his new helper. The others began to sing a different song now with their chimes. It was sad and mournful, a ballad of loss for one of their kin as he turned and began to follow after the gunslinger, who didn't utter even a word of thanks to the clockers. He needed to continue. He hadn't expected his request for help to take so long. Once they were at the edge of the spire and the song of the mining clockers was beyond their hearing, he looked up to his new associate once more. It was certainly bulkier than the others, more complex. "I hope you can fly," he muttered. It looked at him for a moment and then the next spire before them across the chasm. It sank down then, crouching and pulling itself in as to make itself as small as possible. The gunslinger frowned as he watched, hearing the clocker creak and groan for a moment as gears spun and turned. And then it jumped high into the air, shooting forward like a spring. It crossed the distance and landed on the next spire, only to turn and look at him. Was all the gunslinger could muster as he dove off the edge, to catch the wind and rise up to join the clocker waiting for him. With that, they began to travel more earnestly. The gunslinger using the glider to catch the winds and gusts to carry him between the spires, while the clocker would watch and jump once he knew just where the gunslinger would land. On they went as the sun continued to climb through the sky. The gunslinger thought of his destination and could see it now in the distance. A lone peak among the flat spires. While he couldn't see it yet, he knew his destination was nestled into a valley in its shadow on the southern slope. A small homestead that lay claim to one of the most valuable resources there was in this place. Clear, clean water. The closer they got, the more the peak loomed over them, but it wasn't until the sun reached its peak high above their heads that they finally reached the base of the mountain. The gunslinger clicked the wings of his glider shut, knowing he wouldn't need it anymore. He thought about how best to approach. The thin, wispy trees that dotted the land before him, blocking his view of the homestead he knew to be nestled further up the valley. But then he heard the crack of a rifle and the snap and whistle of staffs, and any hesitation fled. His legs and arms burned from the unrelenting travel, but still he ran forward, then pushed forward by a drive that wouldn't cease. Not now. Not so close. The clocker clanked along behind, keeping pace with the gunslinger as he ran between the trees. He saw the fence that marked the start of the homestead. It was wide open, but there were 2 marauders around it keeping watch. The talismans hanging from their belts were brown. He raised the carbine to his shoulder and fired. The first marauder's head snapped back and fell to the ground. The other spun and lifted its staff, but the gunslinger fired again, and that one dropped dead as well.
"How can I help?"
the clocker asked even as the gunslinger ran forward once more. "Kill 'em all," was his only reply, not bothering to stop and wait for the clocker. It took a moment, but then the mechanical man changed. His left arm collapsed in on itself to form a sharp blade, while its right seemed to fortify itself as the hand turned into the head of a hammer. Even its head sank down into its chest a little, while the metal casing rose up, so only its eyes were exposed. Then it ran to catch up with the gunslinger.